I looked down at this parking lot, and I realized that in the parking lot there is an outline of a building that has been put in stone. And the story that Mona told after being in prison and being out in the workyard, and Wendelin saying to her, I'm going to get a chance to escape again, and when I do, you're coming with me. I don't know when, but we're going to do it together. Now, on the morning, March morning, she said everything had been quiet, weirdly quiet for a few days, because they were used to planes flying over, doing a recce. There'd sometimes be bombing missions, but it had been quiet for a few days. And on this March morning, they'd started their detail. People were going outside the prison to work, and she said, and suddenly there were bombers everywhere, and all hell let loose. There were bombs dropping, and she said, she describes it as we were going out, and the men's prison took a direct hit. It went up in flames. All of them were killed. At which point, the prison directress, who actually was the civilian directress, and therefore a little bit more sympathetic to her charges, opened the gates and said, just go. You can take your chance and go to the bomb shelters here, but you saw what happened, or you can get out and run for your lives. So standing on this mound, when I looked down, I realized by the outline, that is the only memorial to the loss of life, is an outline in a parking lot. No plaque, no sign, no story. It's denied. So I walked down the mound and I went through to the other side, which is now a lovely park. And I realized I was standing in what was the airfield. And again, I looked for signs, plaques, memorials. Nothing. Nothing. Now, when they made their exit, they went out to that airfield and they ran. You can imagine bombs dropping in the absolute confusion, and they're dropping into these little holes, and Wendelin leading the way, Mona dropping into it. And she said, we wait till enough of the smoke cleared, I could sight the next one and hope to God I was heading in the right direction. And they ran. She said, we did that a few times, dropped in once on a young German soldier who was so surprised. And she said, and we told him, well, we got caught outside. We'll go back in as soon as it's quiet. And she said, before he could pull his gun or do anything else, she said, I got out of the hole, grabbed Mona, and we continued to run and hoped to God that the smoke and everything else would give us cover. She said, we got into the woods away from the most severe part of the bombing, because of course they were trying to take out the railway links and the roads. And she said, we got into this area in the forest and thought, this is great. Walked out into a clearing and saw a soldier. And she said, we weren't so much concerned about him as she said, I realized that he was guarding a munitions dump. And thought, don't want to be here if the Allies happen to drop a lucky bomb. So she said, we kept going. Anyway, for the next 3 weeks, for the first few days, the weather was nice. She said, we stopped at places and we, farmers, we offered our labor in exchange for food and a place to sleep, which was quite lovely. In fact, the food was so rich that Mona was quite ill the first night, throwing up because she wasn't used to the food. But they continued on their way, but the temperatures dropped. Now, this is March. Temperatures dropped. They had barely what you could call shoes on their feet, short sleeves, little tiny uniforms. But Mona had actually asked the prison director if they could have sweaters because it was damp and cold. And the prison director had let them have sweaters that were not issued. So she said, we had these little aprons, these pinafores that we wore. So we took those off and we put them in the side of the road, buried them in the mud, and kept going. She said, but after a couple of days, these shoes gave out. And Wendelin said to me, we were walking in sock feet until the stockings gave out, and we were walking in bare feet in mud and freezing temperatures. Now, there were a few times that Wendelin knew exactly where she was going, fluent in German, had family in Germany, had traveled there many times, and so Mona was playing a part of a cleft-palated woman who had a mental challenge. And so Mona was okay with doing that, but there were a few times when they were nearly caught. Once when they were crossing the Küsten Canal, and they thought, odd that there isn't a checkpoint here. And she said, we got partway over and we saw the checkpoint. And she said, and you couldn't just kind of go, never mind, because it would invite suspicion. So she said, we got over there, they asked us about our papers. Wendelin, never missing a trick because she's fairly recent to the prison life again, said that, well, we came from Dusseldorf, we lost our papers, the bombing of it. So the guy said, well, go on through, but you're gonna have to find some papers somewhere. That was cool. Then they got to another checkpoint in another town, and the fellow stopped them. The soldier stopped them and said, where are you coming from? Mona was ready to hear Dusseldorf. And where are you going? And Wendelin said, Mönchengladbach. And Mona started to freak out. She said, we never talked about this. What do you mean, Mönchengladbach? And he said, I know it well. Where? What address? And Mona thought, this is it, we're dead. And Wendelin gave an address. And the fellow said, I have a cousin who lives a couple of streets over, have fun, or whatever. Mona said to her, what were you thinking? She said, I would never risk giving false information because I don't know who I'm talking to. So my cousins live in Mönchengladbach. You know, I gave their address. That was fine. They found themselves another time going into a town at dusk, looking for a place to stay, and meeting a fellow on a bicycle, hailed him because lots of refugees moving around at that time, lots of towns were bombed, and too late they saw the Nazi armband on his arm. And again, you couldn't go, never mind. Turned out this fellow was a local police officer and said, oh, I've got lots of refugees in my house, come and stay with us. Oh, great, thanks. So they went, and they had a meal prepared with them, or prepared for all these people. And unfortunately, Mona, who of course is supposed to have a speech impediment, leaned over and said something to Wendelin, and the fellow next to her caught this and jumps up and says, she's not speaking proper German. And all hell breaks loose. And Wendelin, man, this woman should have been in the International Court in The Hague, because she never lost her cool. As soon as she started reassuring people and said, please, appeal to their sense of patriotism. My aunt lost her husband at the front, and she's never been the same since. And she's always had this, and he loved her in spite of her infirmity. So it's such a loss because nobody will be her champion. And everybody went, oh, that's terrible. And so she said, could we sleep in the barn perhaps, because all these people are just making her nervous. So they slept out in the barn and spent most of the night, Mona going, oh my God, what happens if I fall asleep and speak in English? You know, we can't do this anymore. Now they got to a place called Reda on the Dutch border, and they were separated there, and they were there for quite a while. Mona was sent to work on a farm, a very poor man, who was the milk raider. In other words, he had no herd of his own, but he was the one who went and collected milk from everybody to deliver. And he had several children and a not terribly clean environment, and Mona had to share a bed with a 12-year-old daughter. Now, Mona wasn't in great condition. She'd lost several teeth, her hair. You know, you think about this woman who dressed in couturier gowns, you know, the height of fashion. And, you know, she said, well, I guess I didn't really miss my teeth because there wasn't much to chew. But she had to share a bed with the 12-year-old girl. And she said the girl had open sores, there were fleas, and she said all I could think of was what I was going to catch. And of course, because she was playing the part of a woman with a mental challenge, they assumed she was also deaf. So they would yell at her, and they would do things like pull up her skirts, you know, thinking she was too stupid, right? She wouldn't know what was going on. I mean, the number of times that I'm amazed that these children didn't go missing. You know, where are they? I think they're in the field somewhere. But she persisted, and she met Wendelin a few times. She would go over to the field that she was working in, and they would meet and discuss, when are we going to get there? Because I can practically see Holland from here. But there was a bog, you couldn't cross it, you had to choose your time, and Wendelin kept saying, wait, wait, our time will come. Well, come it did, but they weren't together. In fact, they were separated. What Mona didn't know was the Canadians and the Poles were coming sort of up through the middle. And she said one day we'd heard all this artillery fire in the distance, and suddenly it was like in our backyard. And she said we were in the farmhouse, and there was, you know, a fellow setting up a machine gun station over here, and there was artillery, and the farmer's wife grabbed the kids, some bedding and everything, and headed into the cellar. And Mona said, well, I've spent enough time in solitary confinement and prison cells, I am not going down there. So all she did was act wildly, not wanting to be put in the hole. So they left her alone, but the farmer stayed upstairs with her. And she said, and we're up there watching bombs fall. It was surreal. And at one point, there was one that landed quite close to the house. They dove down to take cover, and they saw that there was a soldier out there, and there was a lull in the fighting. They must have been reloading or something, because he thought maybe this was safe time to go outside. He took some food, some sausages, I think, out to this young soldier, and Mona, looking out the window, heard the bomb come in, saw a plume of dust, and she said, and I didn't stick around to figure out, I went down into the cellar. When the fighting subsided, they came upstairs, went out to find the farmer, and she said, we found him in the ditch with the young German soldier, sausage still clutched in his hands, both quite dead. She said, the daughter began screaming. She said, and the farmer's wife saying, help me bring him inside. And she said, we just laid him inside, and neighbors are hammering on the door saying, you've got to get out, you've got to go now. The Poles are coming. Now, Mona didn't understand the dynamic between the Germans and the Poles, and how much the Poles feared, or the Germans feared the Poles because of what the Nazis had done to the Polish people. So they were trying to get out. They were afraid of what would happen to them. So Mona helped the woman load the truck, load the kids on a wagon with the parents, moved it across the bog and into Holland. Finally, she's there. She has no idea where Wendelin is, but she's happy to be back in Holland. She said, we spent the night in the hay, raining, cold, children crying, dogs barking. And she said the next day when the farmer came in to get us, I was so happy to see him and began trying to talk to him in Dutch, which I hadn't used for a number of years. They were quite suspicious because it was mixed with German. And when she finally said, you know, I'm Canadian, I'm married to a Dutch person, and of course the farmer's wife going, no, she's a cleft-palated woman with a mental challenge. Of course, as soon as they found out who she really was, they couldn't do enough for her. And one fellow, she said, I need to get to the British military. I need to find British soldiers. And the fellow said his brother, who had one of the last bicycles in Holland, produced this bicycle and, you know, very proudly and said, I know where there are some Canadian soldiers. I'll put you on the bike and I'll take you there myself. So they bandaged up her feet. She was, at this point, she'd lost toenails. Her blisters had become infected. They bundled up her feet, gave her some clogs, sent her off with some food, and took her down the lane. And she's so happy. She sees these soldiers loading a truck. And she walks up to this one fellow and in English says, please, I'm Canadian, I need to get in touch with authorities to let them know that I'm still alive. And the fellow, now she didn't know that there had been something called Operation Werewolf. And in the archive,